A problem had arisen with the allocation of the teams. Many of the captains were having trouble finding paladins to join them. A few paranormal captains came to Quentin and Joshua. "We want you to join our team," one of them said. "Our members already include a water type, a wind type, a sword type, and a warrior with both sword and lightning abilities. If we work together, we're bound to pass the test." Joshua pushed his glasses up his nose. "And which of you will be the leader?" At once, each of the paranormals raised their hands or called out. Quentin shook his head. "I think I'll pass," he said, and he walked away. Charles, who was observing in secret, was proud to see how he had handled the situation. He had spent a long time curating the test in a way so that it would judge a variety of the potential scouts' characteristics. In order to pass, not only did they need the skills to capture 1,000 mutated animals or zombies, but they also needed to show that they could survive in the wild. And even more than that, they needed to ensure they had a well-balanced team and that they could keep their prey alive for 3 days. Caroline had already managed to pull together a team and had set off. Others had found teammates whose abilities complemented their own and had also left. Meanwhile, Joshua and Quentin were still waiting to find the right team. Soon, only around 100 people remained. Although it seemed that the most skilled people had already left, Charles knew that appearances could be deceptive. An unassuming-looking paranormal approached Quentin. "I may not be particularly strong," he said, "but I have a plan. The brief says we need to collect living things. Well, that includes fish and plants. I have water powers. All I need to do is create a large enough pond, and we'll have 1,000 creatures before we know it." Quentin smiled. "Okay," he said. "You're on my team." He wasn't swayed only by the man's specific plan, but also by his ability to think his way around the problem, rather than just rushing into the task mindlessly. Another paranormal arrived. "I have another way we can pass," he said. "Can I tell it to you in private?" Quentin shook his head. "I don't want you on my team," he said. "But I haven't even told you my plan," the paranormal said. "That's my point," said Quentin. "You're trying to keep your plan secret because you want to win. But this test isn't about winning. We only need to meet the conditions. We don't need to do it first or to beat the competition. We've already been told how dangerous it can be a scout. If you're worried about losing at this first hurdle, I've got no trust in your ability down the line." The paranormal was stunned, recognizing his mistake. He had assumed the test was a competition, so he had naturally tried to keep his plan a secret. But that very mindset had left him without a team in which to compete at all. He realized that the more people who passed the test, the better it would be for all concerned, because it would mean that the scouts would be even stronger. Charles made a note of the paranormal's name, deciding that he would never be hired in any scout team. He knew that even though the man might have his uses, his selfish mindset would only bring down any team he ended up on. The scouts would already have enough on their plate fighting for survival, without also having to worry about infighting as a result of competitive members. Joshua approached some of the other paranormals and was pleased to see that members of different teams were busy sharing ideas. If they succeeded, they would end up with a close bond even though they were on different teams for that task. That was one of the lessons Charles was hoping to teach them. If they couldn't grasp it, he would prefer that they left sooner rather than later. In the end, the remaining people had formed 30 teams of 6 prospective scouts each. However, Charles had already eliminated half of the teams in his head, mostly those who had formed teams without much thought, or who clearly hadn't understood the meaning of the test. Since the apocalypse had begun, he hadn't had many chances to observe his people in such a manner. He knew that observation was very important, as the scouts would form perhaps the most crucial division of his army. In battle, the scouts would be positioned at the very head of his forces, encountering the enemy first, and so he needed to eliminate any who didn't make the grade. On the first day, the leading team captured more than 400 creatures. They had chopped the limbs off some of the zombies, leaving only their heads and torso, so that they were technically not dead yet. In terms of animals, they had chosen species they were most familiar with. Wherever they could, they knocked the animals out and locked them in cages. Quentin and Joshua's team had only managed to capture 100 creatures at that point. Meanwhile, Caroline had captured 390, putting her in second place. When she found Quentin and Joshua, she laughed at them. "I warned you not to underestimate me," she said. "Look at you now." They smiled but said nothing. They knew that it was important to communicate with other teams when they were formulating plans and sharing strategies. But in other situations, it was better to stay quiet. The next day, the situation changed, with disagreements breaking out. We can't leave someone to guard the prey, said the paranormal on one team. Then there won't be enough of us to go and find enough animals in time. But if we don't have someone looking over the captured prey, they could escape or die, said one of his teammates. Then it'll be like we didn't catch them at all. Already 70 of our creatures died overnight. How are we meant to complete the task if we don't have people looking after them? We could go and find mutated plants, said another. Then we might stand a chance. Or we could steal creatures from another team, said another. Are you crazy? Said the one who had suggested the plants. It's against the rules to fight each other. You'd be asking for elimination, if not execution. No, this is a test of cooperation, not stealing from other teams. Why don't we use our crystal cord to buy animals from somewhere else? Someone suggested. You idiot, said another of their teammates. We're testing out to join the Scouts. Do you think that on the battlefield you can simply buy your way out of danger? There were very few rules for the Scouts' assessment, but no one would be so naive as to think there were none at all. Spending money to buy beasts or zombies was not something they could do. No one in their right mind would try to do that. If their teammates found out, they would be kicked off the team straight away. Cheating wasn't looked on favorably. By the end of the second day, more than 10 teams had failed to return, despite not being far from Dawn City. If they had encountered danger, they could have called for help, so their failure to return was surprising. Caroline looked displeased. Her team had taken a long time to settle an internal dispute. That day's harvest of zombies had been less than 200, and some from the first day had died, so her team had less than 500 prisoners in total. At this rate, it'll be impossible to complete the mission within the 3 days we've been given, she thought. Toward the end of the third day, more than 100 people who had already failed the test were worried about their future prospects, and Charles went to talk to them. Don't worry, he said. A single failure doesn't mean anything. Let's see how everyone else does, and then see where you all are in the final results. A little later, 2 huge trucks, one carrying a container of fluids and the other bearing cages, arrived, and Joshua ordered them to be unloaded. There was a zombie or mutated beast in each cage, as well as some mutated plants. Walking over to Charles, Joshua gave his report. We captured plenty of mutated beasts and zombies, so I think my team must surely have passed the test. It was a requirement of the test that the zombies and beasts had to still be alive by the end of the assessment, and some of Joshua's captives had already survived 2 days. It seemed likely they would survive to the end of the test period. Charles nodded. Congrats, you passed, he said. A rousing cheer went up from Joshua's team. After another few minutes, more trucks appeared one after another, each carrying several containers. Quentin's team and 3 other teams submitted the results of their missions and also passed the test. Quentin was particularly proud of his team because they numbered only 4, but had still caught enough zombies to pass. Other teams returned looking very dejected, realizing they had failed. Caroline went over to Joshua and she asked, How'd you do it? How come you succeeded when other teams failed? They had all had the same amount of time, and she knew her team was as strong as his. So why is there such a huge difference in our results? She wondered. Our strategy was very simple, replied Joshua. On the first day of the assessment, we ordered some containers and cages made of dark iron. Then we rented 2 trucks. We caught the mutated beasts on the way. We confirmed our next target the following night and captured the zombies there. And this is our result. Caroline was surprised by his explanation. Planning, she thought. That's what's made the difference. He planned what to do right at the start of the test. It was nothing to do with strength or intelligence. It was just careful planning. Until that moment, she hadn't understood why Charles had given them 3 days for the task. Quentin had come across to them and joined in the conversation. Anticipation of problems is key to a test like this. If we wait until there's a known issue to deal with, we put ourselves into a passive position. If we're going to become scouts, we need to anticipate problems before they arise. Otherwise, we just end up cleaning up a mess instead of preventing the mess in the first place. I can see now that it's vital to discover the enemy's situation at the earliest possible moment and work out their strategy so we can always stay one step ahead of them, Caroline replied. That's much more useful than waiting until they cause us a major problem and having to deal with it off the cuff. Charles turned his attention to her. Why didn't Mark come to take the assessment? Did he think he wasn't strong enough? No, he went on answering his own questions. He didn't take the test because he knows he doesn't have the necessary skill set, and neither do you. Everyone needs a role matched to their abilities. You tried to undertake a mission that you're not suited to. Caroline clenched her fists in frustration. Can I take the test again? She asked. Yes, in time perhaps, but not now, replied Charles. Scouts need to be able to handle the unknown and the unexpected, be it territory or the enemy. They can't just copy tactics used by someone else. To repeat the test now would just allow you to copy Joshua's method, and I need scouts who can use their initiative every time they go on a mission. You'll just have to be patient. Caroline returned to her team. Their failure was a crushing blow to her pride. She had always been proud of her abilities and was devastated to have lost so miserably competing against Joshua and Quentin, especially when they had a smaller team than everyone else. I'm only admitting defeat in this test, though, she thought. There'll be other chances to shine. This is only a temporary setback. I know I can catch up. Charles began speaking to everyone, and Caroline turned her attention to what he was saying. From now on, you are scouts, he said. You've chosen this path, and you can't turn back. You'll enjoy great privileges, but at the same time, you'll also have to face great danger and carry out a very difficult mission. The scouts whispered to each other, wondering what they would have to do. Your first mission is to open up a trade route to the center of the country, Charles continued. When you arrive at your destination, I'll provide all of you with the resources to reach level 6. Everyone's eyes lit up. The vast majority of level 6 warriors were in Dawn City. In the entire eastern region, there weren't many of them, but the scouts would have an exclusive opportunity to reach that level and add to their number. And they knew that Charles always kept his promises. The test was over, and Charles had given the newly appointed scouts their first mission, opening up a supply route into the center of the country. The goods that had been sent to them needed to be shipped to other areas, so a secure route was needed. When Charles inspected all the containers on the trucks, he was angry that the counselors had added so many of their personal possessions to the convoy. He had been expecting a lot of containers, but he counted at least 60 of them, far more than he had planned for. At least a third of the containers were full of things he hadn't expected to form part of the convoy. Olivia could see that he was about to lose his temper, so she tried to calm him down. Don't be too hard on them, she said. They've been through a very difficult time, and I've added a whole load of stuff to the containers too. Dawn City has been spending quite a lot lately, and we both know that the Super Squad Guild was founded on a great deal of money. It's only natural for them to want to turn a profit for themselves. Charles began to calm down. Okay, forget it, he said. As long as they do a good job, I'll turn a blind eye to this. Olivia was right. Financial stability was hard to come by, and people needed to feel that their possessions were safe and their futures were secure. The scouts knew that Charles wanted them to transport the batch of supplies to the military forces across the country. The discount he gave to the military was the same as the discount he gave to his own people, so there wasn't much profit to be made, and that made any other benefits they could come by even more important to them. The counselors knew it helped having Olivia on their side. She had added her things to the convoy, so they felt Charles would be more likely to accept them doing the same. And it seemed that they were right. Seeing that Charles wasn't really angry, the counselors let out a collective sigh of relief. Just as the goods were being counted and ready to leave, Charles received a message that a small group of people led by a young woman was on their way to see him. He guessed what the group might want, and once the scout team had departed, he went back to the mayor's mansion to deal with them. Less than 2 hours later, they arrived in the city. As the group approached, one of them said to the young woman who was their leader, "Do you think we can succeed this time?" "I don't know," she replied, "but no matter what, we have to give it a try." "But how can we recruit reinforcements from this area?" "All I know is that if we don't try, we definitely won't succeed," said the young woman. "If we try, there's at least the possibility that we'll get what we want, and we've gathered enough evidence, so let's do it." The group tried to encourage each other to go inside the mayor's mansion, and when they reached it, they found their passage was unimpeded. Surprised, one of them said, "That was easy." What he didn't know was that Charles had already given the order to let them in. "Maybe this guy won't be too difficult to talk to after all," said another. The young woman tried to keep their confidence up. "I have a good feeling about this," she said. "I'm sure we'll succeed this time." Soon after, she and her small group found themselves face to face with Charles. "I understand you want to see me," he said. "How can I help you?" The crowd could tell they were in the presence of a very powerful man. He had an air of authority about him that made them feel less confident than they had been before they had entered the room. No one dared speak up, but Charles didn't try to rush them. He just waited calmly for someone to say something. After a few seconds of gathering her courage, the young woman stepped forward. "There are a lot of mutated beasts in the Northwest," she said. "Several Shadow Coalition branches are growing around there and gathering intel. We know if we just sit by and do nothing, there will be a lot of trouble." Charles nodded. "Go on," he said. "We're here to ask for help from Dawn City," continued the young woman. "We've heard that the city is the most powerful organization in the Northeast, and its mayor is the most powerful leader." Pausing to gather her courage again, she swallowed hard before continuing. "We want to ask you to send troops to help us." Her previous attempts to make requests for pretty much anything in the past have been unsuccessful, and it left her feeling like a useless failure. So it took a few seconds for her to tune in properly to Charles's reply. "All right," he said. "Sorry, what? What did you say?" asked the young woman, stunned by what she thought she had heard. Charles rolled his eyes at her. "I'll help you. Isn't that what you wanted?" She began to stutter, unable to form a reply. A woman beside her shook her head at the young leader to silence her. "What she means is, we didn't expect the mayor of Dawn City to be so straightforward," she said. "You're obviously a very wise, important man." Charles's mouth twitched. "Wise and important? You flatter me too much," he said, trying not to laugh. "You might like to know that the super squad that went out on reconnaissance recently said they'd encountered fewer mutated beasts, but a lot more swarms of insects. Probably because the weather has been getting warmer. And now that spring has passed, those newly hatched young have formed their own swarms." The young woman nodded, and Charles went on. "In the eastern region, zombies have been very prevalent, and usually mutated beasts are no match for zombies. The population of some other areas is sparse, but the land area is vast. So if mutated beasts and insects breed there in large numbers, there will indeed be a disaster of epic proportions." The young woman's face fell. "So you already knew what I just told you," she said, disappointed that she hadn't given him fresh information. "Yes, of course I did," replied Charles. "I'm the leader here, after all. It's my business to know what's going on across the whole country. Do you think I'd just believe a stranger's claims if I couldn't confirm them myself?" "You know what? You're arrogant," said the young woman. "We spent so much time and energy painstakingly gathering a lot of evidence, and I want you to listen to me and help us." Charles suppressed a smile. "As you've gathered so much information, and you clearly know so much about the situation," he said, "why don't you tell me how I should deal with the mutated beasts? And while you're dispensing your hard-earned knowledge, you can also tell me which species of beasts are out there, what their weaknesses are, how they've multiplied so fast, and what their next target is." The young woman was angry that she couldn't answer Charles's questions about mutated beasts. "I'm not a mutated beast expert," she said. "How would I know?" She was exhausted and not really up to arguing with Charles. "That's no excuse," he replied. "Every living thing has needs. Food, water, a mate, territory. All those things are reasons for wild animals to fight. Even if they transformed into mutated beasts, their basic needs wouldn't change." Charles went on to explain further. "Why do wild animals breed in large numbers? Why do they attack people? Because they want to survive, but there isn't always enough food, so they have to fight to stay alive." The small group looked at him admiringly. "I have one more question for you," he said. "Do you know what the mutated beast's target is?" The young people's faces paled, and they felt ashamed of their lack of knowledge. "If you want people's help, you need to be willing to listen to their advice," he said. "And you need to contribute your own knowledge to the discussion. Otherwise, how can someone trust you, and how can you trust their advice? It's important to be able to say clearly what you mean, what your needs are, and what you can offer." The young woman looked upset, but she managed to say, "We know we're in the wrong. We should have done our research more fully before we came to you for help." Ben Andrews, one of the young men with her, said unhappily to Charles, "So, how do you think we should defend ourselves? If those mutated beasts are after our food, we need to know how to fend them off. It doesn't matter if we don't know their target. We need to prepare for war." Charles sneered at him. "You asked me how to guard against them," he said. "I don't need to guard against them. I have secure defenses here, so they can't threaten me." The group realized that Charles had no reason at all to help them. Ben opened his mouth to say more, but before he could say anything else, the young woman slapped him hard across the face. "What the hell was that for, Kate?" cried Ben. "What's wrong with you?" Kate, thought Charles. Is she my cousin Kate? In his previous life, he had never heard Aunt Sue mention her. He thought she had died in one of the battles. Aunt Sue had lost her husband and daughter, and later she had died to save Charles. He knew now that he had the opportunity to repay part of his debt to his aunt by changing the fate of his cousin, Kate Hulley. Kate looked hard at Ben. If you ever use that tone to speak to me again, it'll be the last thing you ever say to anyone, she said. If you don't have anything useful to say, just shut up. If that's how you're going to behave, you can get out of here now. Okay, shouted Ben. Don't blame me for everything. I knew I shouldn't have wasted my time joining the Shadow Coalition. I should just quit. With that, Ben stormed out of the room. Charles watched his retreating back. I don't suppose he's the reason why you haven't succeeded up to now, is he? He asked mockingly. Kate looked at Charles. How do you know all of our efforts have ended in failure? She asked. Charles rolled his eyes at her again. You came all this way to ask me for help back home. Why wouldn't I assume you'd already failed to get help elsewhere? Kate felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. I'm such an idiot, she thought. It's obvious I tried to get help closer to home first. He must think I'm so young and naive. I apologize, she said. Heaven only knows what you must think of me. And as for Ben, I'll deal with him later. But please, will you overlook my inexperience and find a way to help us? When I get my hands on that hothead, he won't know what's hit him, Kate thought. As if it wasn't hard enough getting such an important man as the mayor of Dawn City to listen to me without that idiot Ben shooting his mouth off. Before I agree, said Charles, tell me how you and your group found the courage to establish the Shadow Coalition. When the prophecy of the apocalypse began to be talked about, there were a lot of people who didn't believe it would happen, she said. The leaders in my area didn't make any preparations, so many lives were lost. I know we could have joined a super squad like lots of others who wanted their freedom, but I didn't want to be with a lawless wild gang. I wanted stable leadership and a powerful backer. So the Shadow Coalition fulfilled your desire for justice, did it? Asked Charles. Yes, it did, Kate replied. I regret not believing the apocalypse prophecy, said Charles. I didn't take it seriously, but neither did a great many people. It all seemed so unlikely, and the world was full of weirdos talking all sorts of nonsense. How were we to know what was a genuine prophecy and what was just yet another silly rumor or more fake news? Mayor Federer, said Kate, trying to bring the conversation back around to the reason she had come to see him. Are you willing to send troops to help us? She hoped to appeal to his sense of justice, but she knew full well that a sense of justice was a rare commodity in an apocalypse. Mayor Federer seems rather formal, said Charles, smiling playfully. Is that how strangers refer to me? But you're not a complete stranger. You should call me cousin. Kate gasped. Cousin? What do you mean, cousin? Then she remembered what had happened the previous month and gasped again in shock. Kate pondered what Charles had just told her. He's my cousin? She thought. Surely there's no reason why he'd lie about something like that. He's the mayor of Dawn City. So he must be who he says he is. Why has no one in the family told me this before? Why didn't you tell us this before now? One of Kate's companions asked her. I didn't know, replied Kate. This is as much of a surprise to me as it is to you. I'd have told you if I'd known, and I wouldn't have stood here talking to him the way I did if I'd known we were related. Kate still couldn't quite believe that Charles was her cousin, but she really hoped it was true, knowing that she would be incredibly fortunate to be related to such a powerful man. Charles knew that his family and Kate's family hadn't been close in the past, and so it was perfectly feasible that Kate wouldn't have met him until now, or known that they were related. His parents had always kept to themselves, and Charles only knew about Kate from military intelligence. But he knew that Aunt Sue would recognize him and Lena, so it wouldn't be difficult to prove to Kate who he was. But I have other important things to focus on, thought Charles. Explaining family relationships will have to wait. He needed to open up trade routes in 2 areas and sell Dawn City products to bring in much-needed funds. And his other major concern was the tide of mutated beasts sweeping across various parts of the country. In the past, he hadn't given much thought to the possible cause of the ongoing mutated beast problem. But now that he had analyzed what he knew, he realized it had started with the wolf disaster in the Northwest. After the apocalypse, carnivores had still been at the top of the food chain, and the army in the Northwest had been weak. As a result, the number of wolves had multiplied quickly. Mutated beasts could use zombies as food, and with all the zombies present in the Northwest, there had been a plentiful supply of food. So the wolves had been well fed and had thrived, causing a disaster for all the humans in the area. The Wolf King had become famous in the ensuing battle, and Charles knew that if that particular wolf was involved in the impending beast invasion, his troops would be in considerable danger. Charles began talking about his plans, and Kate and her group found out that the Dawn City Army had already set off for the Midwest and had taken a lot of military supplies with them to support the battalions that were already there. As she and her companions started talking about what they had heard, Charles learned that the Shadow Coalition was made up of a group of hot-headed young people who had been fans of apocalyptic movies before the real apocalypse had begun. Once the reality of the apocalypse had hit them, they had wanted to fight back and had become very adventurous. One of the young men in Kate's group approached Charles. "I've heard that you're the founder of the Super Squad Guild," he said. "Can more people join it? Can we?" Charles sneered. "All right then. How about you take care of the survival-based defenses?" he said sarcastically. "Or their food supply. Or making sure they have the right materials to make clothing. If you're so eager to join, go ahead and solve all the Super Squad's problems." Feeling suitably reprimanded, the young man realized their inexperience was very obvious to a man such as Charles, and there was a wide gulf between their ideals and the reality of reaching them. He also realized that Kate could put things across to Charles much better than he could, so he decided to keep quiet. Charles understood how inexperienced they were, but he knew that didn't mean they were stupid. They just had a lot of growing up to do. With the Dawn City Army and Charles's group of counselors having already left for the Midwest, there were very few people left in Dawn City. But Alice, Elena, and Jenny were still there. Alice's younger brother had been sent to Kevin's youth training camp in the summer, and Olivia had arranged for Lenny to study logistics and management, so they weren't there either. When Kate saw Jenny, she became angry again. "Why on earth is there a young girl here?" she demanded of Charles. "No matter how confident you are of your own abilities, you shouldn't add to your team's problems by putting someone so young in such a dangerous position. She's a liability." "I know what I'm doing," said Charles. "It's time Jenny learned to protect herself." He knew that she needed to be protected from the Cross Church group, a religious cult from his past life that had been banned in many states. He also knew that it had been founded outside America, so even if communication of Jenny's whereabouts could be controlled within the country, the Cross Church group might still be able to communicate with its leaders abroad. And that meant Jenny wasn't safe. He had decided that the best way to keep her safe was to let her learn how to protect herself. The Cross Church group was convinced that Jenny was the Holy Maiden, a goddess they wanted for themselves. Sylvia had pretended to be the Holy Maiden and had stolen some of Jenny's power. At the same time, some of Sylvia's power had passed to Jenny, giving her some ability to protect herself. But Charles knew that wasn't enough. He ignored Kate and turned to Jenny. "The time has come for you to go on a survival mission," he said. "You'll travel 20 miles into the wild by yourself. If you can't complete the journey, you and your mother will have no food to eat today, and there will be other punishments." Jenny knew she had no choice but to obey. As soon as Charles gave the order for Jenny to set off alone into the wild, she wasted no time starting on her journey. Ever since the previous incident with the Cross Church group, she had been in training, and now the time had come for her combat test. Kate was appalled that Charles would send a young child into the wild on her own. "She's not even 10 years old yet," she shouted at him. "What the hell are you thinking? Letting a child go out on her own to face danger. Don't you have a conscience?" Kate's companions felt the same horror as she did, but they were too frightened of Charles to say anything. They knew he had a reputation for cruelty and killing, and didn't want to cross him. Elena tried to calm the situation. "Jenny has to learn to be independent," she said. "If we keep coddling her, how will she look after herself when we're not with her? She won't always be able to rely on us to keep her safe." Jenny had never felt at ease accepting the help and protection of others, and she knew she had to learn how to protect herself. Whether that was a consequence of the time she had lived through, or just part of her nature, she didn't know. "But she's so young," answered Kate. "You're all level 6 cultivators. There are few people more powerful than you in the entire world, and yet you can't even protect a child properly. If something happens to Jenny out there, how will you be able to live with yourselves?" Charles turned to her. "Either we monitor her 24 hours a day, or we train her to take care of herself for the times when we can't be there to look after her," he said. "You're listening to your heart, not to your head. There's no place for sentimentality in a war zone." Kate was convinced that Charles was wrong to treat Jenny so callously, but decided to say no more. One of Kate's companions, another woman, walked over to Jenny. "Can you tell me how these people usually treat you?" she asked. The rest of Kate's group moved a little further away, worried that if Jenny accused anyone from Dawn City of abuse, a fight would break out. "Last time someone from outside wanted to hurt me, there were lots of people here who wanted to protect me and look after me," Jenny replied quietly. "Later on, a lot of people died, and I was very sad. I wanted to protect my mother and everyone else here." The woman's eyes widened in surprise at Jenny's unexpected response. Elena joined in. "If you have any knowledge of what's been going on in the Eastern region, you'll have heard about the Cross Church Group incident, when their self-destruction caused the deaths of around 10,000 people. Jenny was the cause of all that." The group was stunned. All of them had heard about the Cross Church Group incident. It had been big news when it had happened. Under the guidance of a so-called Holy Maiden, their goddess, the Cross Church followers had killed themselves in a fire. It had caused considerable anger right across the country, so the Shadow Coalition had easily picked up on the news. But they hadn't known that the Cross Church group had thought Jenny was their Holy Maiden. Kate looked curiously at Charles, and he began to explain more about the Cross Church group. "A lot of terrible things have been done in the name of religion by people who choose to interpret their beliefs in the way that suits them best," he said. "The doctrine of the Cross Church group is to love the world, but they decided that meant that their God wanted to release them into the next life, and the way to the next life was through death in the current life. So they killed themselves as an expression of their belief." Kate looked shocked. "You think you know everything," she said, "but why should I listen to you?" "You need to learn to analyze the situation," replied Charles. "If you only react to what your heart is telling you, you'll make bad decisions and put other people in danger." Kate didn't know what to say. She had always listened to her heart, but she still didn't think that was the wrong thing to do, although she knew she could cause problems for herself if she didn't think through the consequences of her actions thoroughly. But she decided not to say anything else to Charles about Jenny and the Cross Church group. Jenny had left while Charles and Kate had been arguing, and she was about half a mile away when she encountered a lot of very large mutated rats. They were very strong and had extremely sharp teeth, and there was no one nearby to help her. She raised her right hand, and hundreds of beams of holy light showered down around her, blocking all the rats' escape routes and turning them into pincushions. Having defeated the mutated rats, Jenny carried on walking without looking back. She remembered that Charles had told her that she and her mother wouldn't be given any food if she failed the test, and she knew she couldn't let her mother go hungry. Watching her walk steadily further out into the wilds, Kate was in awe of Jenny. "Is she already a level 5 paranormal?" she asked Charles. She knew that the use of light-based superpowers was limited to level 5 and above. Could such a young child have reached level 5 already? She wondered. Charles nodded, and then he said to Alice, "It looks like you and Olivia trained her well these past few days. She's adapted very quickly." They all watched as Jenny walked through a patch of wild grass and were alarmed to see that some weeds wrapped themselves around her ankle. When Kate saw that Jenny was in danger, she rushed toward her. However, she had only taken a few steps when a stream of water wrapped around her, holding her in place. "Let go of me," she cried. "What's wrong with you people?" No matter how hard she struggled, she couldn't break free from the water. She watched Jenny helplessly, her anxiety mounting. "This is Jenny's training," said Alice. "We need to see how she copes on her own." Others in the group also wanted to run to Jenny's rescue, but they held back after seeing how easily Alice had trapped Kate. Meanwhile, Jenny was still tangled in the grass. She looked up to see a long green snake lunge at her. When it bit her neck, Elena made a move to save her, but she stopped herself. Kate continued struggling to escape so she could help Jenny, but she still couldn't get free. When she tried to call out, water filled her mouth, choking her. A holy light blade appeared in Jenny's hand. She used it to cut the snake in half and slash at the grass that had tangled around her. Finally, she summoned a fireball, burning the grass around her to ashes. "Her ability to anticipate danger still needs some work," Alice said to Charles as she released Kate from the water. "But her instinct for dealing with it is incredible. She has a natural affinity for fighting." It was clear to the older Dawnians that it would have been better for Jenny to try to escape rather than fight. After all, the goal had only been to cross the field, and there had been no need to fight. In fighting the snake and incinerating the grass, she had wasted valuable energy. However, she was still young and only a few days into her training. Alice would have plenty of time later on to teach her the value of retreating. Kate squatted on the ground, coughing. "Is that real water?" she asked Alice when she regained her breath. The water used by paranormals was a form of elemental energy, and not the same as the water found in nature. It didn't leave things soaked in the same way as normal water, but it also couldn't quench thirst or provide the same health benefits. "If you weren't one of us, that water would have poisoned you," said Alice. "Ordinary poisons are ineffective against paranormals, but we can still catch the zombie virus." Kate continued coughing. She hadn't expected that Alice, who was roughly the same age as her, would be so ruthless as to keep her from helping a young girl, paranormal or not. She wasn't too bothered, though. Jenny had made it abundantly clear that she was more than capable of looking after herself. Jenny walked on for another hour, covering half of the distance Charles had ordered her to trek alone. Her powers gave her enough stamina that she didn't tire. If she'd been an ordinary girl, she would have had to travel much slower, if she'd even been able to manage the distance at all. However, although she was able to face the journey, by the time she reached her destination, her shoes were worn out and her clothes torn. She didn't have any injuries, though. She had managed to defeat most of the monsters she had faced before they had had a chance to get close enough to harm her, using either range attacks or with her long holy light sword. However, after an hour, she began to slow down. She didn't have much soul energy left. At one point, a dozen black beetles flew at her. They weren't very powerful, and if she had been at her peak strength, she would have easily dealt with them. But when she raised her hand to attack, nothing happened. She was completely depleted. The beetles pounced on her, sending her to the ground. Kate cried with shock, but didn't rush forward. From the previous battle, she had learned that it wasn't her place to defend Jenny. Golden light burst from Jenny's body, blasting the bugs. She crawled out from under the bug corpses. "That's a fail," shouted Charles. Jenny turned pale. She wanted to open her mouth to argue, but Elena stopped her. "It's okay," said Elena. "You did your best. You'll definitely pass next time." Jenny nodded and kept silent. She wasn't exactly sure what she had done wrong. Charles didn't respond to Elena. He knew that if Jenny was going to improve, she needed to be encouraged just as much as she needed to be challenged. Otherwise, she was in danger of growing her powers at the expense of her emotional development. Still, he thought she needed to face more and more pressure in order to develop her strength. Kate was relieved. Yet again, Jenny had shown that she could protect herself and didn't need others to worry about her. Elena approached Jenny. "You don't need to use your superpowers on all your enemies," she said softly. "We can use our judgment to preempt some attacks. For example, by checking the grass for monsters. When you attacked the rats, you only needed to kill one or two to make the others flee. But you did really well against the snake." Jenny listened with a serious expression, determined to absorb the lesson she was being taught. She understood that it was useless to regret past mistakes. The only thing she could do was learn from them to avoid failures in the future. Night fell. They made camp and started to cook. Jenny lay in Elena's arms, her eyes fixed on the roast potatoes on Charles's plate. She didn't say anything, but the power of her gaze was enough that he could feel it on him. Alice glared at him too. Eventually, realizing the sour atmosphere, he got to his feet. "I think I heard something off in the bushes," he said. "I'm going to go and check it out." After he had left, Alice passed Jenny 2 skewers of roast potatoes. "Are you hungry?" she asked. "Better eat up while he's gone." Jenny's eyes lit up. She scampered to take the potatoes, and then she hurried back to Elena. She glanced warily in the direction Charles had gone before handing the potatoes to Elena, offering them carefully as though they were the most valuable treasure. "Eat quickly, Mommy," she said, "before he comes back." Charles was conflicted about playing the bad guy so much of the time, especially with regards to Jenny. Although he knew that harsh words and strictness were crucial for guiding her development, he was also aware that he would need to use a softer touch at times. At the end of the day, he wanted Jenny to be able to protect herself, not become a heartless killing machine. Kate and her teammates left to report their progress to their survival base. Meanwhile, the Dawnians slowly carried on with their trade route mission. Each member of the team for the mission had been carefully chosen for their individual abilities and how well they worked together with others. With such a large group, even though they would scare away the mutated animals, they would likely attract zombies and bugs, so they knew they had to be prepared. The Knights of Hell made sure to kill any zombies or other threats along the way. Within 8 days, they had managed to kill all the zombies in 3 cities. Dawn City had made no secret of opening the trade routes, so many powers in the eastern region had begun to put out feelers to gauge how they might benefit from the New World Order. Of course, they weren't stupid enough to challenge Dawn City directly, but they had made some initial moves to increase their chances of gaining a foothold down the line. Everyone understood the business opportunities that communication between the different regions would bring, and Charles didn't order that those people were punished or driven away. He understood the benefits that would come if more people were making use of the routes, whether they were working for Dawn City or other entities. The important thing was that they developed the routes in the safest way possible. On the whole, Dawn City didn't have much in the way of people or energy. If other parties decided to establish survival bases, shelters, and relay stations along the route under their own steam, that would only benefit Dawn City. Charles didn't care about other people profiting from his ideas, as long as he got his share too. He wasn't the sort of leader to raise himself up by pushing others down. The way he saw it, the higher others aimed, the further they would elevate him. On the 10th day, Charles's group crossed Nest Lake. He kept in touch with the army from afar, and he learned from Tina that in the past 10 days, only 10 knights had died. Meanwhile, some of the reserve knights had been expelled for violating the rules. Many of those who had been expelled had met with the team led by the 4 counselors, which was nearby. The team had over 5,000 people. They had lost around 200 people on their way, most of whom had died after an ambush in the night. Such raids were becoming more and more common, with more monsters hunting under cover of darkness. The forces protecting the trade goods stopped at another section of Nest Lake, which was swarming with bugs. "How can there be so many?" asked one paranormal. She used her wind powers to send sharp gusts across the water, killing more than 20 bugs. Another released hundreds of ice darts, killing dozens more of the insects. "At least they'll give us plenty crystal cores," he said. "It's easy money." Although mutated animals were much more valuable than bugs, the process of killing and carrying them was much more problematic. It was much easier and more beneficial to target the swarms of insects, whose crystal core soon added up to a small fortune. Still, even so far into the apocalypse, very few bugs have reached level 3. The majority of their crystal cores were only at level 1 or 2, while others couldn't produce any crystal cores at all. On the other hand, many of the people in the Super Squad had no interest in killing bugs. They were strong enough that it was easy for them to deal instead with the high-level zombies and mutated animals. The profit from killing a level 4 zombie was the same as a swarm of 300 insects. A few powerful wind-powered paranormals suddenly realized something was wrong. "Get on your guard, everyone," one of them said. "There's a big swarm approaching. Make a ring around the trading goods." "Are you sure?" asked another. "Why would they choose to attack now?" "Shut up and get ready to fight," said the first paranormal. 6 months into the apocalypse, the smarter paranormals had learned that at such times, it was better to prepare to fight rather than ask mindless questions. Most had learned to trust the instincts of the wind-powered paranormals. They might not always have been right, but it was better to be overcautious than underprepared. After a short commotion, everyone had prepared to defend themselves and their payload. They surrounded the vehicles carrying the containers, with some powerful paranormals remaining near the containers in case the bugs broke through the defenses. Although the containers were made of dark iron, they could still be damaged. Everywhere, the paranormals capable of long-range spells headed for the high ground or used their powers to summon platforms to give them a vantage point. All the while, the high-ranking paranormals issued orders to ensure that everyone knew their role. The bio-altered paranormals joined forces with the other warriors, who had the highest endurance level and could be counted on to deal with the bulk of the enemy forces. Although the spell-casting paranormals could kill dozens of insects with the wave of a hand, and others could even kill hundreds at a time, to launch such mass attacks would quickly deplete their soul energy, and so the higher stamina of the regular warriors was invaluable. The first swarm arrived after 20 minutes. "Prepare for battle!" cried one of the commanding paranormals. The various members of the Dawn City army had fought side by side many times, and their experience showed. They cooperated seamlessly, presenting a formidable force. They quickly got into line, often seeming to follow an order before it was even made. The sky began to darken with a swarm of approaching insects. There were so many of them, it was impossible to give even an estimate of their number. The scouts should have some wind-powered paranormals, right? Tina asked Joshua. Try to isolate the level 5 bugs and let us deal with them. Joshua nodded. He opened his mouth to answer, but then he turned to look behind them, frowning. What is it? Asked Tommy, and then he turned to look in the same direction. I'm not sure, said Joshua, but I think there's something over there. I don't think these insects are here to attack us at all. They seem to be just passing by to get to whatever's on the other side of us. But by that point, the bugs had arrived, and battle had commenced. Charles lowered his communication token. They're saying there's a swarm of bugs on its way, he said. He didn't seem in a rush to act. Tina had told him that although there were a lot of insects heading for them, they didn't seem to pose much of a threat. Although most of the high-powered warriors like Miranda had stayed in Dawn City, the counselors were strong and resourceful, and Charles was confident that they could handle themselves. The force protecting the trading goods had over 30 level 5 paranormals under their command. All told, there were 130 level 5 paranormals taking part in the mission. Part of the reason so many of them had signed up was that they had known that if they had remained in Dawn City, Olivia would have found some way to suppress their development. Many of the paranormals were proud and arrogant, and they resented the idea of staying behind to be treated as nothing more than labor. They knew that if they were successful in establishing the trade route, on the other hand, they might never have to return to working for Dawn City, and might be able to set up their own force and bases. It helped that more than 200 knights and scouts had joined them, enough that they didn't need to worry about Charles always being nearby to protect them. Can we eat this fish? Jenny asked. She dragged a fishing net along the ground, which was ensnared a large fish. It flipped and kicked around, but couldn't break free of the net. As part of her training, Jenny wasn't only being taught how to fight, but also how to survive in the wild, on her own if necessary. Although she was too young to appreciate all the information she was being taught, she didn't want to disappoint those close to her, and was eager to find the most nutritious food. She had come a long way. In 10 days, she already had a good understanding of how to live in the wilderness. Charles glanced at the fish. Mutated salmon? He asked. You can eat it, but it isn't very wholesome. He put the salmon in the energy storage space and brought out some other food. Let's eat this instead, he said. As they ate, he explained that although mutated salmon wasn't the most nourishing food, it was very rare and could be used to produce water-repelling pearls, which would become very valuable in the future when the water pollution issue would become even more severe. Jenny was disappointed that she hadn't caught a more nutritious fish, but after learning of its other uses, she said, I'm going to go and catch some more. I saw a few others in the lake that looked exactly the same. What? Asked Charles. You saw more of these? He looked at Alice, both open-mouthed. They tried to quickly regain their composure. Are you sure that's what you saw? Elena asked. Jenny nodded. A bunch of them tried to attack me, she said. When I caught that one, the others swam away. You need to stay away from the lake, said Charles sternly. It's too dangerous. Jenny became alert. Although she was young, she understood that Charles was in charge, and if he was saying that something was dangerous, she had better listen to him. Charles went to the lakeside and used his soul energy to scope out what lay beneath the water. He didn't use his detection ability all the time, because it would sap his energy. But after using it for just a moment, he quickly made out something strange at the bottom of the lake. Under the calm surface, many fish were either hunting for food or hiding. He probed deeper and discovered a dilapidated palace made of crystal. It was slightly different from the one he had encountered before and was very run down. Some fish patrolled nearby. The soul energy he had used to detect the place bounced back at him. The source of the resistance was an invisible barrier of some sort below the palace, which defied his efforts so violently that blood began to seep from the corner of his mouth. He wiped it away without changing his expression. He was entirely focused on his task. The reason for his focus was that he believed he could sense a giant turtle under the lake, and he was vividly reminded of his chase with Leonard down the river. Just when he had been about to kill Leonard, his mortal enemy had been eaten by a giant turtle. He still didn't know if the turtle's aim had been to save or kill Leonard. In fact, he wasn't even sure if Leonard had died. That point alone was enough to stoke his fury. Are you all right? Asked Alice, running over. I'm fine, he said. Use your water powers to drain the lake. He pointed ahead. If it's easier, freeze that part and drain the rest. Although she didn't know what Charles was thinking, Alice got to work. She'd gone to great lengths to develop her water control. Although her ice control wasn't as strong, it was enough to help her out. She easily froze a large portion of the lake, creating a dam of sorts. Just as she was about to drain the rest of the lake, the surface of the water shifted. Charles could sense that there really was a giant turtle on the lake bed, and that it had just flipped over. The huge turtle spiraled up out of the lake. It soared into the air and then it lunged toward them. Charles readied himself to fight the monster. The last time he had faced a giant turtle, he had been weak. He wouldn't let another one get away so easily. Alice created a water shield. After reaching level 6, her shield had grown in size so that it was more than enough to protect the 4 of them. The turtle collided with the shield, creating a large explosion. Next, Alice froze the air around the turtle to weaken it further. While Alice was fighting the turtle, a figure near the lake leaped into the water. Charles had only had a brief chance to look at the figure before it disappeared into the lake. But he knew exactly who it was. It was Archer. In Charles's previous life, Archer had succeeded in obtaining the Water Mansion's treasure, which he had believed to be crucial to unify the world. Archer had thought that only under his leadership would the country advance and make its way out of the darkness of the apocalypse. He had asked for Charles's help, but Charles had been so determined to find his sister that he had turned him down. Later on, Charles had heard that Archer had tried to take control of the military, convinced that only by controlling the army could he make people listen to him. It hadn't worked out for him, however. When Charles realized that it was Archer at the lake, he realized that Nest Lake had to be where Archer had found the Water Mansion token in his previous life, and where it had to be located in his new one. It was the 3rd time that Charles had encountered a giant turtle, and he thought that was too much to just be a coincidence. He stretched out his arm, and his tattoo turned into the Black Lightning Dragon. It stretched its huge wings and soared into the sky. Then it lowered its head to face the lake, a vicious look in its eyes. Although it wasn't particularly intelligent by human standards, it could still recognize an opponent it had fought before. It seemed to easily recall that another giant turtle had bitten off a large piece of its flesh not too long ago. Charles turned to his team. "Elena, protect Alice while she drains the lake," he said. He approached the edge of the lake, crouched down, and placed a hand on the water. Then he looked up at the Black Lightning Dragon. "Time for your revenge," he shouted. At Charles's order, the dragon dove into the water. Before long, the surface of the lake bubbled as the water reached boiling point, stirring up wave after wave. Charles diverted the water into the energy storage space. It wasn't that he couldn't fight underwater, but he knew it would be foolish to try to take on the giant turtle in its own element. Meanwhile, Alice continued to displace the water from the lake. She and Charles managed to shift most of it, while Alice's frozen dam took care of much of the rest. Archer leaped out of the water and landed on the shore, cursing. He had only dove into the water to retrieve something from the bottom, and he had hardly expected to encounter a battle between 2 almost godlike beings waiting for him. He shook the water off his body and looked at Charles and the others. His gaze lingered for a few moments on Jenny. "Why is there a child here?" he asked. "And who even are you guys? You need to take the girl away, it's too dangerous." "Why did you come here?" asked Charles, looking away. "What's it to you?" Archer asked, frowning. Charles sighed. "Jenny, teach our friend a lesson," he said. Although Charles and Archer would come to know each other well in the future, many of their interactions would be in combat. Because of that, Charles didn't plan on being too civil in their first meeting. Jenny summoned a holy light cage around Archer, trapping him inside. Then a holy light sword appeared in her hand. "The little girl has powers?" asked Archer, obviously shocked. He mustered some ice that froze the cage around him and allowed him to break free. Once he was out, he summoned some creatures made of ice and snow. Charles observed him with some admiration. He knew that there were few who would survive the apocalypse if they weren't prepared, and it was clear to him that Archer was prepared. Alice recognized the creatures as ice guards. They were strong fighters, and as they were made of elements rather than flesh and blood, they couldn't be mortally wounded. However, in the time it had taken him to summon them, Jenny had arrived in front of him. Although she had initially enjoyed using light-powered attacks, she had since found them a waste of energy when she could simply use her sword. She had learned that her light attacks were best used in a supporting capacity. With one stroke, Jenny cut the ice guards in half. They were vaporized into droplets that quickly disappeared. "I don't want to attack the child, but you're forcing my hand," shouted Archer. He summoned a wall of ice and snow. Although he would find it difficult to harm a child, If Jenny was a powerful enemy, he wouldn't let her age stop him. "Nobody's forcing you," called Elena, appearing behind Archer. "We're threatening you. If you want to live, then surrender." Archer froze when he felt the tip of Elena's crimson flame sword on his throat. Although Jenny had held her own against insects and other creatures, Elena hadn't been confident that she would be able to compete with another paranormal, and so she had taken it upon herself to step in. "How shameless, using a child as bait," said Archer. "You're the one without shame," said Charles. "You made the mistake of taking your enemy at their word, and then you were so focused on the child that you didn't pay any attention to the rest of us. You're lucky you've survived this far." Archer took a deep breath to calm himself. "Thank you, truly," he said. "I can see my mistake. I won't underestimate you again." In a way, he was glad to have been bested, because it meant he wouldn't have to kill a child. While the fighting had been going on, the level of the lake had dropped a great deal. The black lightning dragon and the giant turtle were still fighting at the bottom, throwing mud and water into the air. Charles looked Archer right in the eyes and he asked, "Why did you go down there just now?" "You seem to care a lot about what's in that lake," said Archer. At that moment, the black lightning dragon let out an angry roar. The giant turtle had just torn another piece of flesh from its body. However, the turtle wasn't in much better shape, with severe burn marks over much of its head. The crystal palace on the turtle's back had been reduced to ruins in the fighting. After the dragon's roar, a ball of water flew up from the bottom of the lake, bearing a token and some beads. Archer's mouth opened in shock when he laid eyes on the token. Charles took out a similar-looking token. Then he took the one from atop the ball of water and put the two together. "If you don't want to tell me that you're right," Charles said, "but that beast at the bottom of the lake and I have some unfinished business. Until I've sorted things out with it, you best be careful." He put the two tokens in his pocket. Archer had watched the tokens keenly. Once they were out of sight, he turned to look into the lake. He could still hear the roaring and tearing from the bottom as the beast battled on. "You really think I'm about to interfere with those two?" he asked. Alice began to glow with a blue light, and then the water at the bottom of the lake formed a huge chain, binding the giant turtle to the lake bed. The black lightning dragon took the opportunity to fire a bolt of black lightning at it. However, even though it was trapped, the turtle specialized in defense, and so even the more fearsome of the dragon's attacks caused minimal damage. Moreover, it was able to spit a jet of water from its mouth, attacking the chains with such powerful force that they shattered. However, no sooner had they broken to pieces than they reformed, binding the turtle once again. The struggle was so fierce that mounds of freezing mud had built up around the turtle, quickly turning into an ice shell. Although the creature battered the ice with its tail, it was unable to completely break through it. Some symbols appeared in Charles's hand. They were in the image of 9 explosive flame amulets, 9 lightning spears, and several different types of extract amulets. They fused together, allowing him to use his divine wrath. When combined, the different extract amulets drew out a huge amount of power, condensing all of Charles's soul energy so that it was primed to use as he saw fit. He hadn't learned divine wrath from his book, but had created it himself. The reason he had never used it in the past was that it demanded a stronger control over the extract amulets than he had felt himself capable of. However, he had recently sensed that his power level had finally exceeded that which he had possessed in his previous life, and so he used the divine wrath for the first time. Archer watched in terror as energy crackled at Charles's fingertips. A long golden spear appeared in Charles's hands, flickering with white lightning and surrounded by gleaming flames. He launched the spear at the turtle. The point broke through the ice and pierced a hole in the turtle's body, bursting it open with a massive explosion. The turtle let out an angry and miserable roar. It couldn't move. The black lightning dragon pounced at it once again, biting down on its head and sending its lightning power directly into the turtle's body, burning it up from within. However, the turtle's head was hard enough that it wasn't enough to kill it. It continued struggling to free itself, although it was powerless against the dragon's attacks. Charles jumped and landed on the giant turtle's back. He activated the beast taming amulet, but the turtle resisted, draining the amulet of its power and slightly injuring Charles. "If you won't submit, then you die," he cried. He summoned the Sword of Death into his hand and brought it down on the turtle's head, piercing the creature's skull. Although there were many who admired enemies that refused to yield, Charles had no patience for them. The greatest respect he was willing to show the turtle was a quick death. The death energy spread through the turtle. But even Charles's immense power couldn't completely snuff out all the turtle's life force. He focused all his soul energy in an attempt to refine the turtle's remaining power, sending it into the energy storage space. At that moment, though, the giant turtle regained its strength. Charles knew that the turtle had arrived in the human realm from another world, and it seemed that that world was trying to take it back. The only reason it had remained in the human world for so long was that its power had been sealed, keeping it from growing too strong for the dimension in which it found itself. Charles's divine wrath had broken that seal, and the laws of the universe demanded that the turtle be expelled to a world more befitting of its power. In the future, giant turtles would be able to reach the saint level. Although the turtle in front of him wasn't quite there yet, it wasn't far off. "No, it can't escape," cried Charles. But he could feel it getting away. The speed at which its energy was entering the storage space was slowing. If he didn't act quickly, the turtle would slip from his grasp once again. As the giant turtle slowly faded away in front of Charles, it suddenly spoke. "The next time we meet, you'll die," it said. Most level 6 monsters could understand and speak human language. The Black Lightning Dragon was one creature that was unable to speak because of the special characteristics of its species. But the giant turtle clearly possessed such an ability. It hadn't spoken before, but that wasn't because it had wanted to hide its intelligence. It had stayed silent purely because of its contempt for humans. But Charles had provoked it to anger, and so it had finally spoken those vicious words. The giant turtle's body was growing fainter, which worried Charles. "Tell me where the last human you saw went," he shouted at it. "And where's the Dominion tablet?" The turtle remained silent, but its aura grew stronger. Its disdain only made the fire in Charles's heart burn hotter. What right does this mere beast have to look down on humans? He thought indignantly. The last time he'd encountered the turtle, it had snatched Leonard right out of his hands, and now it refused to say what it had done with him. The turtle's physical form was fading, but its vitality was increasing, and Charles grew frustrated. Even if he were to break through to a higher cultivation level right then, he wouldn't have been able to catch up to the turtle in the spatial realm, where soul energy acted like water that everyone floated in. A being's concentration of soul energy determined their density, and also gave them extra layers of protection. The more powerful they were, the further they would sink. Humans and creatures from Earth were relatively weak. Overly powerful life forms could sink all the way to the bottom of the water-like space in the spatial realm. And since the giant turtle's level was higher than Charles, it would have the advantage there. But he couldn't let the turtle escape so easily. "No," he cried out. "Even if you escape, you're not doing it in one piece." Charles had never been a good-tempered person, and he felt downright hostile in that moment. He harnessed the power of the cultivation method he had learned from the nameless ancient book to refine the soul energy and life force of the giant turtle as much as possible. The turtle's huge eyes were filled with ridicule. It had lost its ability to resist, but the damage Charles had inflicted on it so far was insignificant to it. Compared to the magnitude of its strength, the loss was tiny. As soon as it returned to where it belonged, it knew it would be able to recover quickly. As the energy entered Charles's body to be refined before going into his energy storage space on an endless loop, he grew impatient. He knew that at the slow rate he was absorbing its energy, by the time the turtle escaped, he would have only dealt a fraction of a percent of damage to it. No more than a drop in the bucket. His body was already overwhelmed by the level of refinement he was asking of it. He was only a level 6 paranormal, and his refining speed was limited by the realm he was in. If things continued as they were, the refinement would take a huge toll on his body. He knew it wasn't worth it to ruin his body for the sake of wounding the turtle. Then he saw the chain of water vapor that Alice was desperately trying to bind the turtle with. It was destroyed a few times, but she rebuilt it every time and fought for control. Watching her made Charles realize something. There was no reason he had to use his own body as a transit station. The cultivation method he was using refined everything to its purest soul energy. The higher a being's level, the purer its refined soul energy would be. Theoretically speaking, he could infinitely improve himself that way. But even an unlimited water tap was limited by the size of the storage tank it was poured into. He felt silly for his error. Why should I limit the amount of refined soul energy I can absorb to what my body can handle? He asked himself. "Energy storage space, open for me," he ordered. At his command, the passageway leading from his energy storage space to the real world was forced open, and it linked directly with the turtle's body. The cultivation method he was using began circulating at full power. It was as if a dam had been opened, and all the turtle's energy surged into the energy storage space. That freed Charles from having to use his body as a mediator. He was able to absorb the soul energy without even having to refine it. But there was a disadvantage to the process. Such a large influx of soul energy couldn't be controlled. So much of the farmland inside his energy storage space was destroyed by its power. Many Treants were also consumed by the chaotic energy before they even had a chance to scream. The giant turtle let out a despairing roar. "No! What have you done?" it cried. Its body was slowly materializing again, as the power that surged out of it was sucked into the energy storage space. It was suddenly afraid that it might actually die. Charles pulled out the crimson flame sword hanging at his waist and stabbed the giant turtle's head. "Tell me, where's the human you ate the last time we met?" he demanded. "Where's the Dominion tablet?" With his body no longer in danger from the swirling energy, Charles could direct his attention to interrogating the turtle. Its life was in his hands. "I don't know what you're talking about," the turtle shouted anxiously. "If you don't know, then there's no reason to keep you alive." Charles couldn't tell if the giant turtle in front of him was the same one he had met before, but it didn't matter. It had already provoked him, so it had to die. The turtle's soul energy shook the energy storage space unceasingly, and the space seemed to work on its own using Charles's own technique to process the influx of energy. "So the nameless ancient book really does have such a method," he muttered to himself. "I still have a lot to learn." But he only spent a moment sighing in wonder before focusing once again on the turtle as a strong force descended on it. It was already at the border between Earth and the spatial realm, and it couldn't resist the powerful suction. It let out a desperate roar. "How dare you!" it cried. "You'll all die for this. My leader will flood the whole Earth, and you humans will pay the price for your arrogance." Its venomous words did nothing to help its situation. The turtle finished turning into soul energy and disappeared into the energy storage space. Archer had watched the entire scene in a daze. The giant turtle's powerful soul energy had been enough to make him tremble in fear, but Charles's strength was even more terrifying. As Archer considered the conflict they had had before, he was comforted. "He didn't kill me earlier, so he probably won't kill me now," he thought. Once the turtle was gone, the lake water broke through the ice wall and flowed back into the lake. Charles used his cultivation method again to collect a large amount of lake water, but soon he felt a repelling force, as if something was trying to stop him. It didn't take him long to figure out the reason. He knew that the repelling force had to be the world's will. When he'd used the cultivation method to refine things from the world and return them to himself, those things had belonged to him. He had been born and raised on Earth, so the world's will hadn't interfered at first. But if he put certain things directly into his energy storage space, the world's will would try to stop him if it saw fit. The entire process of refining the giant turtle's energy had been very smooth, perhaps too smooth. Charles wondered if the world's will had secretly helped him. In his past life, no one had been able to explain this phenomenon clearly, but when the invaders had arrived, the world's will had played a very important role. In Charles's past life, all life forms originating on Earth had received help when fighting against the invaders, and the invaders had been weakened. It hadn't seemed like much at the time, but it had had a direct impact on the outcome of many battles. Some people had thought that their success in battle had only been a coincidence of the environment, but more people had believed that it had been Earth's way of protecting them because they had been born and raised there. Other humans who had betrayed their own kind by surrendering to the invaders had also been rejected by the world's will. Charles realized he would have to wait until the invaders arrived before he could use the power of his energy storage space without any interference. Until then, he could only use the things he took from the Earth himself. The world's will didn't like to provide resources to other worlds, and since the energy storage space had grown immensely in size, and in the amount of life and resources it held, this space was technically a different world entirely. After he figured that out, Charles felt indifferent. He knew that as long as he stayed loyal to humanity, he would eventually find himself facing an alien enemy, and he would have more use of his energy storage space. He examined the space to inspect the damage. A large area of farmland had been destroyed, as well as some experimental fields. Over 200 tree ants had died. But he didn't feel sad about the loss. The space was the size of a large city, and everything that had been destroyed was only the equivalent of a small town. It was an insignificant portion, and the sacrifice had been worth it to be able to refine the giant turtle. If he wanted, he could even give up some of his own energy to speed up the growth of the crops, and that energy wouldn't disappear. It would just transform into low-level energy for a period of time before transforming back into high-level energy. After a simple inspection of his energy storage space, Charles returned his attention to the outside world. "Thank you," Archer said emphatically. "You saved my life. If you ever need my help in the future, you've got it." Charles raised an eyebrow at him. "Aren't you afraid that the token was an opportunity that I've stolen from you?" Archer shook his head. "I don't know if that token was an opportunity or not," he said, "but I do know one thing. The monster guarding it was very unfriendly to humans, and I think it's for the best that it's gone now." He took a jade pendant out of his pocket. "I came across this pendant. It once guided me to the bottom of a river, but I wasn't strong enough to reach it. 2 days ago, the pendant led me here to look for something. I thought it was an opportunity for me, but now I'm not so sure that pursuing this opportunity is a good idea." He was an intelligent person. The giant turtle had clearly been confident in its strength, since it had taken the time to have a brief conversation. But its words had been filled with arrogance and contempt toward humans. Archer didn't see how anything good could come from a monster like that luring someone into what Charles was calling an opportunity. Charles took the jade pendant and looked at it for a while. Then he asked, "Did you pick this up by the sea?" Archer was surprised. "How did you know?" "Lucky guess," Charles said. "The giant turtle isn't a creature from Earth. A normal lake or river couldn't contain such a huge creature, and Nest Lake is connected to the sea." He had encountered giant turtles 3 times, and Archer had come from a region near the sea. Charles guessed that when the giant turtles had descended into the world, they had to have appeared in the sea first. In fact, when he had been chasing after Leonard, the giant turtle had probably come to him from the direction of the sea. "What if someone arranged all this?" Archer asked. He frowned. He had originally thought that he deserved to seek out opportunities for glory, but everything that had just happened felt more like a blow to the head. If someone was orchestrating all the events he had once seen as opportunities, then it felt as if he was no more than a pawn in someone else's game. "It might not be," Charles said. "But in the future, if you encounter something that seems too good to be true, be cautious until you figure it out. You might miss a few opportunities, but you'll probably live longer." He turned, preparing to call Elena and Alice to leave, but he stopped when Archer called out to him. "Wait a minute. Are you still not going to tell me your name? How am I supposed to contact you?" Without turning around, Charles said, "My name is Charles Federer." Archer laughed. "Charles Federer? Just like the famous mayor of Dawn City." The smile on his face froze as realization dawned on him. It was said that the mayor of Dawn City had a huge black serpent that had transformed into a black lightning dragon. Archer wondered if that had been the monster that had fought the giant turtle. He sucked in a breath of cold air, recalling when Jenny had attacked him, and realizing that, if he had fought her, Charles would have killed him on the spot. Charles didn't intend to make peace. He didn't want to give up on his friendship with Archer, but he needed to see if Archer's path would be any different in his new life than it had been in his previous life. Some people believed that the future was fated, and that no one could control it or escape it. Archer was a key piece in the game they both found themselves in. Charles needed to find whoever was acting behind the scenes, and he needed Archer in order to do that. But he had to be strategic about it, and he knew it would be best if it looked like chance. Just as the 2 men were about to part, a voice cried, "Bugs incoming!" Charles used his soul energy to probe the area, and detected many insects in the distance flying toward them. They could already hear the sound of their wings. Elena and Alice became alert, while Jenny tried not to make any noise. The black swarm of insects flew through the darkening sky, devouring everything in their path, including trees and mutated animals. When the humans were the only living creatures left in the area, the swarm descended on them and attacked. Charles and the others were about to move to defend themselves when an ice sword slashed through the air around them and killed the swarming insects by the dozen. He turned to see that it was Archer, who hadn't gone far. "I'm not doing you a favor," Archer said, "but we need to work together to get through this crisis." He didn't even pretend he was helping them out of the goodness of his heart. Everyone who had survived so long in the apocalypse had some level of cunning or skill, and he knew better than to treat them like fools. If the 2 groups separated, they would face 2 waves of insects alone. But if they fought together, they would face one common enemy, and they would be stronger. Even separate super squads who encountered similar situations in the wilderness would usually join forces. Charles didn't reject Archer's help. Instead, he joined the battle. Archer was obviously skilled with his ice sword. He was very good at group attacks. He fought well with Elena and Jenny, who dealt with many powerful insects that got too close. After 20 minutes of fighting, all the insects were dead or gone. Archer heaved a sigh of relief. Then he dissected some crystal cores from some of the high-level insects he had killed. The higher the insect's level, the higher the probability that they would produce crystal cores. "These are my spoils," he said to Charles. "Now I'm leaving. Goodbye." Archer had killed far more than the insects he had dissected, but he was only one person. He knew that if he was too greedy and tried to take away the crystal cores from all the insects he had killed, it might cause Charles to turn against him. He didn't want to risk it, so he wisely took only a few. Charles didn't pay much attention to what Archer was doing. After summoning a few shadow demons to pack up the spoils of their battle, he took out a communication token and received a message from the convoy. "The swarm has retreated. Some people were injured, but no one is dead. It seems like the insects were just passing through. Now they're heading east." Charles was surprised. People who had lived in the apocalypse for a long time usually had very strong intuition, especially when it came to danger and unusual situations. Their main force was about to reach the Midwest, and Charles's group was still at Nest Lake. He realized that the insects had to have first passed by the convoy before coming to the lake. They had eaten any edible creatures they had come upon, so it did seem like they had just been passing through, and that it had all been a coincidence. But is it really just a coincidence? Charles wondered. He still felt uneasy. His gaze fell on Jenny, and the sense of danger only increased. He knew something was wrong. "Summon your nightmare horses and catch up with the main group," he ordered. "Quickly. We have to get to the camp as fast as possible." As he spoke, he summoned Bullet, picked Jenny up, and placed her on the horse's back. Although Alice and Elena didn't understand the reason behind his orders, they still instinctively obeyed. They quickly summoned their nightmare horses and disappeared into the night. Charles got on his horse. "Tell everyone to be on alert," he said to Tina. "The danger may not be over yet. Don't let your guard down. We have to get back to camp." Tina passed his order on to the Knights of Hell. They weren't happy about it, but Charles's status convinced them to obey. Everyone quickly became on guard. Dawn City had begun as a democracy, albeit one with unequal levels of power. But as Charles's prestige had kept increasing, he had long since left democracy in the dust. Dawn City was what Charles said it was, and no one dared to challenge his words. Even if they disagreed with him, they had to bear with it. After they left, the swarm of insects went to Nest Lake and landed on the shore. Hundreds of thousands of insects stopped flying and sat by the lake, not moving at all. In the darkness, one giant insect loomed over all the others. It was over 15 feet long and was so heavy that it could hardly move its feet. The giant insect let out a strange roar, and all the other insects looked at it in unison. Charles and the others who had left Nest Lake rushed to the camp as fast as they could. The distance was about 30 miles, but at full speed, they arrived in less than 10 minutes. When they arrived at the camp, Charles looked with satisfaction at the people who were on guard. They were fully alert, and they hadn't hesitated to carry out his orders. They knew that in the harsh world of the apocalypse, they had to be alert to danger, regardless of any orders if they wanted to protect themselves. A few of the counselors crowded around him, planning to inquire about the situation, but he didn't wait for them to ask questions. "Everyone stay on alert and take turns resting," he instructed. "The scouts are already deployed. A few of you can also send some of your fastest scouts. I suspect our enemies have surrounded us, but they haven't made a move yet." Tommy was shocked. Surrounded? How was that possible? We've been scanning the area. They had traveled all the way there to open a trade route, and that involved eliminating any hidden dangers along the way. They had explored the area thoroughly. After all, the lives of many people and their source of income were on the line. They were taking great care. Charles glared at him. "Do you doubt me?" "Of course I don't doubt you," Tommy stammered, averting his eyes from Charles's piercing gaze. Charles had always tried to be fair, although he did give preferential treatment to those who were closest to him. But he expected an equal exchange for the benefits they got from being in his inner circle. This was especially true for the Knights of Hell. Nearly all their strength came from Charles, and he expected them to be willing to pay for that with their lives, if necessary. Upon Charles's order, 28 scouts quickly set out. The counselors also sent out their own scouts, who were the fastest paranormals and warriors among them. Although only Charles's inner circle could ride nightmare horses and two-horned horses, everyone else could trade for fire horses, which were a little stronger than two-horned horses. They couldn't compare to nightmare horses of the same cultivation level, but they were still reliable mounts. Many paranormals weren't happy about that, though. They knew Charles held the contract for the summoning of any mount, and if he wanted to revoke someone's right to ride a certain horse, he could do so with a single thought. They had to remain wholly loyal to Dawn City if they wanted the privileges that came from it. After about 40 minutes, one of the scouts sent a message through their communication token. "It's not looking good out here. There's a large group of zombies 30 degrees east of us. I can't tell quite how many, but there's at least 5,000. They seem to be waiting for orders from their leader, but all the zombies are looking in our direction." After hearing the news, everyone back at the camp began to worry. "You mean the zombies are just sitting there doing nothing?" Alex asked. "Even if there aren't any humans nearby for them to prey on, surely they would be hunting some mutated animals or something." Another scout reported back. "About 22 miles northwest of camp, there's a huge group of mutated animals resting on the spot, waiting for something. We estimate there's about 10,000 of them, but there must be someone controlling them." The third scout gave their intelligence report as well. "I'm about 25 miles away at 75 degrees northwest, and there are at least 10,000 zombies here as well." Over the next few hours, the scouts reported back one by one. Each new piece of information only made the hearts of everyone in the camp sink further. They were surrounded by various groups of zombies, mutated animals, and insects, humanity's three greatest enemies. The swarm of insects they had encountered before was also cutting off any chances of escape. The humans would encounter enemies in any direction they went, and if they went one way, they would only leave their backs exposed to another enemy. "Why is this happening?" Hugh lamented. He had been with Charles for a long time, but even he looked pale. "There are three major factions here, and there's normally a great deal of conflict among them, so why have they united against us?" Taylor was also surprised. "I don't like it," he said. "It'd be bad enough if one group of monsters had set up this trap, but having three joined together is just too much." Everyone else was similarly dismayed at the thought that three of their major enemies had formed an alliance. Charles was silent for a few seconds before he launched into giving orders. "Everyone take turns resting. I need everyone at their best and prepared to fight at any time. Hugh informed the military in the Midwest that their goods have arrived, but have been intercepted. Ask them to come and collect the goods themselves. Don't hide the danger here from them." "Yes, sir," Hugh said. After everyone had left to carry out their orders, Elena asked, "Is all this because of Jenny?" When Charles had rushed them from Nest Lake to the camp, she had noticed the concern in his eyes. She knew the source of all the trouble had to be Jenny. "Yes," Charles said, not wanting to hide anything. "It's no coincidence that these three factions have united. None of them are intelligent enough to have come up with a plan like this on their own. There must be a mastermind behind all this, controlling the leaders of each faction and telling them what to do." Alice sucked in a shocked breath. "Who could do such a thing?" she asked. That was a hard question for Charles to answer. He knew too much, but all his information was from his past life, and he had no way to tell anyone without revealing his secret. And if he did that, he would immediately become the target of public criticism. Elena looked like she was warring with herself. "What if I took Jenny away alone?" she asked. "Would that end all this?" "Don't think like that," Charles said. "I'll continue to protect Jenny, and it's not just because she's a child. She's very important to the entire human race. If she fell into the hands of the enemy, the consequences would be unimaginable. Her death would have a terrible impact for all humans." Elena was silent. She didn't know why such a fate had befallen her daughter, but she knew one thing. She needed Charles's help to protect Jenny. She couldn't bear the pain of losing her daughter, and she would use all her strength to make sure that didn't happen. It didn't matter to Elena if countless people had to die to keep Jenny safe. Charles took out a map and marked out the intelligence he had received from the scouts. The three factions were divided into more than 10 different camps in a circle around them. The closest enemy camp was about 18 miles away. As he thought about the insect swarm, he became certain that the enemy was sufficiently prepared and had a great understanding of the Dawn City team. Jenny had been at Nest Lake before. If the enemy had wanted, they could have surrounded them at the lake, but they had waited until they had returned to the Dawn City camp. That was intriguing to Charles. as was the fact that the insect swarm hadn't really seemed interested in attacking them as they had passed by. That meant the enemy didn't want to kill them all, and that was a very human sort of tactic. Charles knew there had to be a human mastermind behind it all, but there were too many people who had been trailing behind Dawn City's caravan. It was impossible to eliminate the suspects one by one, but Charles had his own plan for finding the mastermind. Nothing happened all night. The enemies they had detected nearby didn't seem to have any intentions of making a move. They looked like they were waiting for something. Charles wasn't concerned. He just calmly lit a fire to cook. He would have had someone else do it for him, but it was a habit he had formed over a long time, and he still liked to do it personally. Letting others handle the cooking for him made him uneasy. He knew that when a leader looked calm and composed, then his followers would settle down as well. After all, if he wasn't worried, they shouldn't worry either. Everyone rested or patrolled, and everything seemed to be under control. Charles used his communication token to send a message to the military in the east, and the military said they would send troops to retrieve their resources. They didn't want to lose their goods, but it wasn't a simple task to gather and mobilize an army or to clear out any enemies along the way, and they weren't just coming to the camp. They also needed to prepare to take their supplies back with them. All of that would take some time. But before the military could arrive, the Dawn City Army welcomed an unexpected group. Kate showed up with nearly 200 people, and it looked like they were all from the Shadow Coalition. Charles narrowed his eyes as he took in Kate and the mass of people behind her. He hadn't expected to see his cousin again so soon. "What are you doing here?" he asked. She didn't seem to notice the change in his expression. She lifted her chin and said, "I heard you guys were in trouble, so I brought my friends here to help. Everyone in our coalition is an excellent fighter, so we'll be able to help you get out of this mess." Charles frowned. "How did you know we were in trouble?" Using his soul energy, he scanned the crowd without leaving any traces. Then he clenched his fist and asked, "Who told you?" It would have been fine if Kate had only arrived there at that precise moment coincidentally, but the fact that she had known they were in danger made Charles suspicious. He had only told the military about their predicament, and the military was disciplined enough not to leak that information. Besides, the entire operation was a matter of military supplies. Even if Kate's group had somehow found out the news from the military, it would have taken time for them to gather so many people to travel there. It seemed likely that they had already known Dawn City was in danger, even before the military had known, perhaps even before the swarm had passed by. The people of the Shadow Coalition looked offended by Charles's implication. Some of them acted like they were going to leave, and others griped back at Charles. "What do you mean? We came here in the name of friendship to help you." "That's right. We came here with good intentions, but if we had known how ungrateful you would be, we wouldn't have come at all. This is a waste of our time." Kate also looked unhappy. She'd brought everyone there to help, but it wasn't turning out at all like she had hoped. Instead, Charles was making her look bad in front of the Shadow Coalition. The woman beside Kate had a nasty expression on her face. She pulled on Kate's arm and said, "Come on, let's go. It looks like they don't need our help." "Who gave you permission to leave?" Charles demanded. "Dawn City, prepare for battle." He pulled out his Crimson Flame sword and struck the ground with it, cutting a ravine more than 60 feet long. In unison, the Knights of Hell pulled the machetes from their waists and raised them toward the sky. They didn't know what Charles was thinking, but they would follow his lead. Everyone was ready to fight. In less than 5 seconds, the Shadow Coalition had been surrounded, and they all quaked in fear. Although they were ready to fight, none of them dared to attack first. The weapons that Tina, Hugh, and Tommy held emitted a powerful aura that enveloped the entire group. Some of them even found it difficult to breathe. "What are you doing?" Kate asked, so enraged that she was shaking. She still doubted whether Charles really was her cousin, but everyone in the Shadow Coalition had hoped it was true, so that they could have a powerful backer. Now that she had led them into a dangerous situation, though, she was filled with anger and regret. "I don't have time for this right now," Charles said. "You have 3 seconds to explain, or we'll kill half of you and interrogate the rest very, very slowly." The air was filled with tension. All the Dawn City troops were ready to fight. "1," he began. "Stop," called a voice. A man in his mid-20s emerged from the middle of the group with a gloomy look on his face. "There's no need to count. I'm the leader of the Shadow Coalition, and I can explain what happened today." He hadn't wanted to let Charles finish counting to 3, because he believed Charles would act on his threat to kill half of them and torture the rest for information. The young man had met many bad people before, but he had never met anyone so ruthless. He could tell that Charles was serious. "Speak, you only have one chance," Charles said, staring the man down. "I'm so sorry," Kate said to the leader, after he stepped out from the crowd. She felt responsible for the whole mess, and she was on the verge of tears. The leader looked at her apologetically. "I don't blame you for this," he said. "I've underestimated everyone here. You seem to have forgotten one thing, Kate. Although you told me that the Dawn City group had arrived, I was the one who told you that they were in danger. I just didn't tell you how I knew about the danger." His voice was full of bitterness. She frowned in confusion. "What does that matter?" "It matters a great deal," he said. Then he turned to Charles. "If I'm not mistaken, this danger only came to you last night." "But that's impossible," one of the Shadow Coalition members couldn't help but exclaim. "We've been on our way here since the day before yesterday." Their leader had summoned them to come to the rescue 2 days earlier, but Dawn City's enemies had only arrived the previous night. They wondered what was going on. The leader of the Shadow Coalition took out an old book and handed it to Charles. "This is the Book of Prophecy," he said. "I found it in an old antique shop. At first I couldn't see that there was anything special about it, but I've since found that its predictions are all very accurate. It predicted the apocalypse for a start." The Dawnians assembled there looked from one to the other, open-mouthed, trying to gauge if he was telling the truth. Charles took the book and turned to the first page. An entry dated toward the end of the previous year described a great catastrophe, which would lead to zombies and demons overrunning the world. On the next page, he read a prediction for a couple of months after that, describing a meteorite that would fall from the sky and land in the southwest of the country. Then he read another prediction, detailing the opening of a gate to the underworld soon after that. He flipped through the pages until he landed on one foretelling that someone would bring hope to humanity by defeating demons. He noted that the date for that page was much earlier than when the same event had taken place in his previous life. "I didn't take the entries seriously to begin with," the leader of the Shadow Coalition continued. "When the apocalypse broke out, I was focusing mainly on just surviving. But when I found the meteorite that it mentions, which fell in the southwest just like the prophecy says, I realized that I might be able to use the predictions to save people. I didn't understand at the time exactly which person it was referring to, the one who would help to kill the demons. But when I heard from Kate that you were transporting military supplies to the Midwest, I realized that it must be you." He stalled, seeming to be awestruck to be speaking to the very beacon of hope that he had so far only read about, the savior of the Midwest who would defeat the demons. Meanwhile, Charles had seen right through the man's delusions. "What's your name?" he asked. "Javier Martin," said the man. "The book is yours now. I hope you can fulfill its prophecies and lead humanity out of these dark times." He didn't care who owned the book as long as it could be put to good use. "How generous of you," said Charles, sneering. "I'd like to say this is a great honor, but I'm not so sure that it is." Javier turned red, unable to hide his embarrassment. In fact, it was more than embarrassment. He was angry that Charles was being so flippant about the book's grand prophecies. However, just as he was about to lash out, the gleam of Charles's sword caught his eye. Javier calmed down and looked at the floor, but his face hadn't lost any of its redness. The Coalition members also struggled with how to respond. In their opinion, their rescue mission had been a complete failure. They couldn't believe that the Book of Prophecy had fallen into the hands of the enemy, and they were anxious to see what Charles would do next. "I can't believe you were fooled so easily," Charles said in a calm tone, handing back the book. Javier was reluctant to take it back, but Charles forced it into his hands. "I admit it's a pretty convincing antique," he continued, "and I can see that whoever put it together went to great lengths to write it in an old script. Still, you must be pretty gullible if you fell for it." The Coalition members bristled to hear their leader so blatantly disrespected. "But the entries are real," Javier shouted in a fluster. "All the predictions have come true." He couldn't quite explain his panic, but he felt sure that something inside him was about to snap. "You said that you've been guided by the book," said Charles. "For example, it said a meteorite would appear in the southwest, so you went to the southwest. You followed it blindly, not giving any care for the consequences of your action." Javier's face turned pale, but he accepted that what Charles had said was right. When he had first read about the meteorite, he he had indeed traveled to the southwest without much reflection or consideration. His discovery of the meteorite there had started his path to forming the Shadow Coalition. Although he had been amazed by the book's accuracy, he had also been unable to shake the feeling that he no longer had any free will, and that the book had begun to call the shots. "The book came to me, and I've had no reason to suspect that it isn't entirely truthful," he said, the desperation evident in his voice. "So why shouldn't I follow everything it says?" On page 3, it foretells that another crisis would follow, the opening of a gate to the underworld, said Charles, still calmly taking apart Javier's every certainty. "That's why you journeyed to the north, to see if you could solve that crisis. The beginning of the apocalypse, no less. I respect your courage, but you have to wonder why the book didn't properly explain the source of the disaster." "But it does," Javier said, trembling. "The gate to the underworld. That's the reason all this is happening." Charles shook his head. He knew that people would always believe only what they wanted to believe. Javier wasn't prepared to accept that the book wasn't genuine, because if it really was false, then all his choices over the past months would have been for nothing. "But that's not true," said Charles. "Every general in the north knows that the source of the disaster was Leonard. Your book isn't any better at telling the future than I am, and I'll give you a prediction here and now." He lit a flame of true fire in his hand. "I predict that someone here is about to die." Javier clutched the Book of Prophecy to his breast as Charles approached with the flame in his hand. Then his body suddenly released a massive amount of soul energy. Black scales started to appear over his skin, 2 sharp horns sprouted from his forehead, and his teeth turned to fangs. His muscles grew, causing his shirt buttons to pop open and the fabric to rip. "Don't you dare!" he roared. Death energy seeped from his body. Charles continued to reach for the book with his true fire flame, as calmly as if he hadn't registered Javier's transformation at all. "So you're one of the Death Demon tribe," he said. He had known of Javier's true identity all along. It was only asking the question to maintain his guise of ignorance. However, although he had heard of the Death Demon tribe, he had never seen such a transformation for himself. "Javier," said Kate, trailing off, her eyes wide in disbelief. "What's going on?" The other members of the Shadow Coalition were also on their guard, their hands on their weapons. Javier couldn't understand why they looked so scared. "Alice, show him his reflection," said Charles. Alice crafted a blue mirror from ice and held it up to Javier. Beholding his demonic appearance, he bellowed in a rage and smashed the ice with his fist. Of course, that only succeeded in shattering it into countless other mirrors. "What happened to me?" he asked. "This is impossible." "The meteorite you found was sent to this world by the Death Demon tribe," said Charles. "Although it's given you a great deal of power, it's also infected your body and is slowly turning you into one of them." "The Death Demon tribe?" asked Javier. The paranormals who were present knew some things about the Death Demons. When they had gained their powers, they had also inherited some memories shared by all paranormals, which had taught them things not only about the divine realm, but also about hell. However, the memories only gave them fragments of information that weren't of much use, and it was difficult to draw any reliable conclusions from them. A ball of water appeared in Alice's hand. At a moment's notice, she would be able to turn it into a deadly spear. The death energy surrounding Javier gradually faded. He looked at Charles in horror. "What's going on?" he asked in a whimper. "This book was a trap," said Charles. "The so-called prophecies don't have any real bearing. They were only written to lead you to the meteorite so that the Death Demon tribe could take control. They must know the truth about the apocalypse, but of course they wouldn't reveal this in case you interfered in their plans." Javier began to sob. "So I'm nothing but a pawn in their game?" he asked. "Then what have we been doing all this time?" A member of the Shadow Coalition stepped forward. "Have all our ideals been for nothing?" he asked. "No," said Charles. "Not for nothing." He shot the flame in his hand at the man, who fell to the ground. The man screamed as death energy started pouring from the wound like black smoke. Then his body was engulfed in true fire. "It might not be your fault," said Charles, "but that doesn't mean you haven't become our enemy." With that, more than 20 of the Coalition members seemed to burst with auras of black energy. They transformed into demons just like Javier, with scaly skin, towering horns, and deadly fangs. They let out bestial howls and turned on their teammates. Demons and non-demons alike, the Coalition members descended into a brutal fight. fighting with fists and blades and claws. Some of the paranormals tried to put distance between themselves and the demons. Once they were a safe distance away, they tried to use their powers to control the situation and target their teammates who were emitting death energy. So death energy has invaded the world already, thought Charles. Once again, he reflected that he couldn't rely on his knowledge of his past life, as things in his new timeline were developing at an unexpected rate. For instance, the enemy was clearly preparing for its invasion much earlier than it had done so in his past life. And when he considered the weakness of the human race, he could hardly blame them. Not only were humans physically weaker, but they had also fallen into a passive state, taking for granted the bountiful resources and relative peace they had known prior to the apocalypse. Although the enemy had yet to open the spatial channel that would allow the bulk of its forces to pass through, it was clear that the invasion had already begun. They had been managing it in secret, and Charles assumed that the reason their plan had been exposed had something to do with Jenny. He understood that they were after her, keen to use her powers to allow them to advance further. The fight with the demons was over quickly. Although the coalition members who had been infested with death energy were stronger than the others, there had been fewer of them. When the dust settled, most lay dead on the ground. Some had been killed by the members who hadn't been infested, while others had been torn apart by other demons in their frenzy. Kate looked at Charles in horror. "What did you do?" she asked. "What did you do to them? Can you turn them back?" "It's best that you leave the coalition," Charles said. "Go home to your mother. You'll be safer there. We can't tell how many of your other teammates will have been infected." Kate was humiliated. "You really don't think I have a chance out here?" she asked. Charles ignored her. Instead, he turned to his followers. "Prepare for war," he said. "The enemy has made its first move. It's time to fight back." Charles thought back to his previous life. He and Archer hadn't ever really had much interaction. They had been more like acquaintances than close friends. Archer had obtained a treasure called the Water Tablet in the Water Mansion. 2 months after his death, the Poseidon Tablet had appeared, attracting the attention of various powers. It hadn't been long after that Leonard had obtained the Genesis Tablet. After obtaining the memories from Oscar, Charles had assumed the Genesis Tablet was the same as the Dominion Tablet. He also remembered that the people who had obtained the treasures corresponding to his Celestial Tablet had wanted to trade their items for the Celestial Tablet. However, the first person who had come to trade with Charles had referred to the Celestial Tablet as the Celestial Earth Tablet. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, and had assumed that the trader had simply been using a different name for the same thing. But it seemed that the matter was a little more complicated. He finally understood the relationship between the different tablets, together with their corresponding treasures. The 2 parts of each tablet had a specific function. The first acted as a key to access the treasure, while the second was the actual treasure itself. Unfortunately, there was nobody who could verify his suspicions, as it was impossible for him to return to the past and learn exactly how Archer had died. However, he was certain that there had to be an issue with the 3 treasures. He felt that he had ended up with more questions than answers. If he was sure of one thing, it was that he was glad that he hadn't come across the tablets in his previous life, when he wouldn't have known the correct way to approach them. He took out the Water Mansion token and the items he had taken from Leonard's followers, and sealed them before putting them into the energy storage space. Then he climbed astride Bullet and galloped to Miranda and the others. Thanks to their dark iron armor, the knights hadn't suffered any injuries in the fighting. However, there were only just over 100 of them still left alive. Leonard's forces hadn't killed any of them in the most recent battle, but some had still died after depleting their soul energy during their guerrilla attacks on Leonard's camps. Although their dark iron armor provided a great defense, it couldn't protect against harm from within. Moreover, its protection against elemental attacks was severely limited. It was strongest when defending against physical attacks. The knights had all been prepared for death when they had first gone into battle. They had known that Charles would take good care of their loved ones in the event of their death, and by the time they had finally fallen, they'd almost been closer to their fellow knights than to their actual family, so they also had had the assurance that their comrades would do all they could to avenge them. Miranda hurried over to Charles. "Is it over?" she asked. He nodded. "It's over." The knights within earshot collapsed to the ground, finally giving in to their exhaustion after learning that their struggle was at an end. They took off their helmets and threw them to the ground. Some started sobbing. Although their mental fortitude was far stronger than that of ordinary people, the last few days of relentless killing had taken its toll and had pushed them to the limits of their endurance. Their loyalty to Charles had been the only thing that had kept them persisting up to that point. Upon hearing that the battle had ended, they were able to release the almost unbearable tension that had built up over the last days and weeks. Charles didn't judge them. He had had 10 years to accustom himself to the apocalypse, and was impressed by how well his followers had adapted in only 3 months. In those 3 months, they hadn't only been required to kill zombies, but also their fellow humans. Since the battle had ended, there was time to let them rest and process all that they had gone through. He took some grass from the energy storage space and fed it to the knights as 2-horned horses, which had also been through a lot. They were so tired that if he left them to return to hell and hunt for food there was a chance that they would starve to death before they were able to find any sustenance. After ensuring that his followers and their mounts were okay, he contacted Lewis using his token. It was only when Lewis confirmed that the fighting at the arcane wall had ended that Charles finally allowed himself to feel some relief. After half an hour of rest, the Knights of Hell began their return journey. The total number of casualties in the war had exceeded 200,000. More than half had been regular soldiers. Charles was heartbroken to think about the great loss. It somehow seemed worse that, rather than dying against mindless zombies, they had fallen in a battle against their own kind. But he knew that if they hadn't sacrificed themselves, there would be even more casualties in the future. Still, the deaths of so many regular soldiers left the army in a bad state in that part of the country. Charles could see the grief in the eyes of the surviving soldiers. He was impressed by how well the generals had organized things in the battle. They had stabilized the situation as quickly as they had been able, giving up any war zones where defeat seemed inevitable, in order to focus their defenses on the capital itself, rearranging the various divisions to their best effect. After 2 days of rest, the soldiers had recovered somewhat. Some of their wounds had healed on their own, and Charles and his paranormals helped to heal as many remaining injuries as they could. They were able to tend to most soldiers, and only found themselves powerless when they came across soldiers who had lost limbs or been severely mutilated. It required the use of many of the crystal cores Charles had been keeping in the energy storage space, but he was eager to do anything he could to help them. The Montreal Division had lost more than 3,000 people. More than 2,000 of those had been elites. However, the war had required so much cunning and ability that the remaining troops, even those who had been amateur troops at the beginning, had all developed the skills of elites. Charles organized a new camp where his followers could rest. After setting it up, a group of paranormals from the Super Squad came to find him. "I've sent people to investigate the families of those who died," he said to them. "I'll fulfill my promise to you." "That's not what we're here for," said one of them. Although the Super Squad members had been forced into working for him, they had since developed loyalty to him. "We simply came to say that, as long as you keep to your word, we'll follow you with complete loyalty. We'd like to join you as official followers." "You want to join me?" Charles asked the Super Squad members in front of him. He wasn't too surprised. He knew that it was only natural for people to want to join the strong, regardless of their previous allegiances. The most recent battles had shown the Super Squad members that they weren't quite as powerful as they had thought, and their pride had been bruised. In their previous skirmishes, they may have been strong, but in the recent large-scale fighting, it had hit home that they weren't much more powerful than ordinary paranormals. And after witnessing the superior strength of the Knights of Hell, it made sense that they had admitted their inferiority and recognized the value in following such a strong army. In the 2 days they had spent counting the casualties, they had had plenty of time to realize that the Knights had only grown so strong with Charles as their leader, and that such a power might one day belong to them if they followed him too. He looked them over. Although only a few of them had come to find him, there were 300 or 400 Super Squad members in total who wanted to join Charles's team. He knew that that number of paranormals would be a great benefit to his forces in the battles to come. They were already powerful fighters, and with all his resources and knowledge, he would be able to develop them even further. However, he didn't plan to take them on with no conditions. "If you want to join me, you have to accept my rules," he said. "Under my command, you'll have access to the strongest power and equipment, but you'll have to work for it. Specifically, you need to provide me with certain resources. It won't be cheap, but I think you'll find the rewards are worth it." He took out some lists of the resources he had in mind and handed them to the squad members. You don't have to give me your answer now. Look over the lists and talk to my team before letting me know. The members of the super squad looked at each other in dismay. They had thought that Charles would accept them with open arms, glad for the added manpower. Instead, rather than a gracious and grateful leader, he was acting more like a haggling merchant. It made them question exactly how he had won the loyalty of his followers in the first place. Still, they took his advice and went to speak to those who had followed him for a long time. Charles knew that there was no such thing as loyalty for loyalty's sake. There were conditions that needed to be met to protect that loyalty with payment or benefits. And it needed to be Charles himself who provided those benefits, whether through his superior resources or his cultivation training. Others were happy just to be given regular meals, but it was still Charles's responsibility to ensure they received them. The reason that he didn't give promises of protection easily was that the cost of fulfilling them was so high. Moreover, it was difficult to maintain true loyalty when the people in question had high expectations for its rewards. Most of the Super Squad members were at level 4. If he provided them with the level 5 resources that they were no doubt expecting, that would be an uneven trade, with Charles spending valuable resources on people who might not even be able to use them to their best ability. The Knights of Hell were different. They had no expectations of Charles. Even if he only gave them knowledge of level 3 skills and abilities, they would still be happy. The fact that he had nourished their allegiance so well meant that since they had become able to kill level 5 creatures, they did so fanatically and with absolute loyalty and love for their leader. Even after the war had ended, their loyalty to Charles hadn't dimmed. They understood that they had only become so powerful because of him, and they relied on him for any further development. Therefore, they had a close and stable relationship with him. Even those like Tina who were unable to awaken their powers understood that he was still able to show them how to make the most of their strength, and so they were also very loyal. Meanwhile, his more powerful followers, like Anthony, knew that they would still be able to live a good and safe life even if they left Charles's side. Their relationship with him was more one of equals. Instead of coaching the Super Squad purely for their own benefit or to boost his forces, Charles would prefer to train warriors who would become among his closest followers. Still, he was aware that they might turn elsewhere. For example, if they decided to ask Olivia to take them in instead, she would be able to supply them with high-quality weapons. For that reason, he needed to make sure he was giving his own direct followers enough benefits to remain behind him. He gave the squad members the same conditions as his ordinary followers. They were free to come and go, and they had to work for their rewards. They weren't the same conditions as he gave to his closer followers, but he made it clear that he would give the most benefits to those who were able to supply him with the resources on his list. Resources were scarce, and he needed to do all he could to forge loyalty while also making sure he had enough resources that people would want to join him in the first place. If he couldn't feed and arm his people, he would soon have no people at all. And not only did he have to think about the food required to feed his ordinary soldiers, but he also needed to ensure that he had the right resources, such as crystal cores to aid his paranormals. Above all else, he needed to make sure that he wasn't promising anything he couldn't deliver. While his followers rested and reorganized themselves, he found the families of the Super Squad paranormals who had died in battle. He told them that if they were willing to follow him, he could guarantee that they would be given food, water, and protection. Those who didn't want to leave the area would be given daily supplies by the military. As long as they remained in the area, their safety would be guaranteed. Charles would personally arrange it. More than 200 paranormals had died, which meant that he was making his promise to around 200 families. Many of the families were skeptical of his promises, but after he told them that they would still receive food and water from the military, even if they didn't literally follow him to his next location, they agreed to his request, while others asked to join the military's logistics division. After Charles had made his arrangements, the Super Squad members returned to him with their answer.